The peasants bow before their protector, a 100 tons of walking destruction. They call him Savior, God, shield against the darkness. But inside the cockpit, Baron Terran feels their fear beneath the worship. When famine strikes, he will learn what the Imperium truly values, and it isn't human lives. The voice of duty speaks in whispers until it becomes a scream. I remember their faces before everything else. Before the honors of my house, before the litanies of activation, before the searing communion with my knight, their faces. The people of Varelia looked upon me with what I once called reverence, but now recognize as fear. They would scatter their meager crops before the thundering footfalls of righteous dominion, my histories pattern knight-errant, as if appeasing an angry god rather than honoring their protector. My ancestors told me this was proper. This was the natural order of things. The peasantry existed to serve, to toil beneath the shadow of our greatness. For 10,000 years, House Terran has stood as the bulwark against the darkness that threatens to consume mankind. And for 10,000 years, we have demanded tribute. The day I first bonded with righteous dominion remains as vivid to me as yesterday, though nearly 2 decades have passed. The sacristans worked through the night, anointing every joint and servo with sacred unguents, whispering binaric prayers to soothe the machine spirit before our communion. I had prepared for years, my body and mind honed through countless trials. I was the 9th son of Baron Alcides Terran, not expected to inherit, but trained nevertheless in the family tradition. 7 of my brothers had already taken their place as knights. Only Lucius, the firstborn, remained at our father's side as heir apparent. When I entered the sanctum, I felt the weight of generations watching me. Our ancestral home on Varelia, unlike our primary holdings on Valuris, was modest by the standards of imperial nobility. Built into the mountainside overlooking the vast grain fields that fed a dozen neighboring systems, Castellan Terran was nonetheless imposing to the local population. Its spires of adamantium and stone rose like accusing fingers pointed at the sky, while its foundations delved deep into the rich earth, drawing from the planet's bounty. The throne mechanicum waited at the center of the sanctum, bathed in the crimson light of censers and mechadendrites that swayed like mechanical snakes. I remember the first touch of its cold metal against my skin. I remember the neural jack sliding into the surgically implanted port at the base of my skull. And then I remember the pressure of 10,000 years of memories and expectations flooding my consciousness. The bond between knight and pilot is not a simple interface of man and machine. It is a communion with every previous occupant of that throne. Their experiences and prejudices burning themselves into your mind like brands. I felt my great-grandfather putting down a peasant uprising 2 centuries before. I felt the righteous pleasure as he drove his thermal cannon into the heart of the revolt. The screams of the dying like music to his augmented ears. I felt my cousin Tybal cutting down Zeno's raiders who threatened the northern settlements. I felt his bitter disappointment when the villagers fled from him in terror after he had saved them, their primitive minds unable to distinguish between one threat and another. And underlying it all, I felt the machine spirit of righteous dominion itself, ancient and prideful, judging me worthy or unworthy to bear its mantle. It pressed against my mind like a physical weight, seeking weaknesses, probing for doubt, for hesitation, for anything less than absolute conviction in the superiority of our bloodline and our duty. I emerged from that first communion with my identity intact, but irreversibly altered. The sacristans declared it a strong bond. My father placed a hand on my shoulder, his gauntlet heavy with the weight of authority. My remaining brothers looked upon me with a mixture of pride and envy. Only Lucius seemed troubled, his eyes searching mine for something he feared to find. That night, alone in my chambers, I dreamt of walking across the fields of Varelia. But I was not in my own body. I was a colossus of metal and ceramite, each step crushing the fertile soil beneath me, and the peasants scattered before me, not in an orderly procession of tribute, but in blind panic. I awoke, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding against my rib cage. I dismissed it as nothing more than the after effects of the bonding process. The sacristans had warned me that the first few days would be difficult, as my mind adjusted to the neural interface, but the dreams continued. Night after night, I would find myself looking down upon the people of Varelia, not as their protector, but as their doom. And with each passing night, I began to hear their voices. At first, they were merely wordless cries of terror, but gradually they coalesced into prayers, not to me, nor to my house, but to the God Emperor himself, desperate pleas for deliverance from their feudal overlords. I spoke of these dreams to no one. To admit such weakness would be to invite scrutiny, perhaps even accusations of mental instability, and an unstable mind could not be trusted with the power of a knight. I had seen what happened to those whose communion with the throne mechanicum went awry. They were stripped of their honors, confined to the lower levels of Castellan, their names never again spoken in the halls of our ancestors. Instead, I threw myself into my duties with redoubled vigor. I patrolled the borders of our holdings, hunting down the primitive orc raiders that occasionally emerged from the dense forests to the east. I stood sentinel at the great harvest festivals, righteous dominion towering over the proceedings like a watchful parent. I received the tithes of grain and ore, and human labor with stern approval, as was expected of me. And for a time the dreams receded. I convinced myself that they had been nothing more than the growing pains of a new night pilot. The natural adjustment period as the throne mechanicum rewrote portions of my neural architecture to better interface with the ancient technology. I was Baron Gasterin, ninth son of Alcides, pilot of the honored knight-errant Righteous Dominion, servant of the Omnicia and the Emperor both. My path was clear, my purpose unquestioned. Then came the blight. It began in the eastern fields, a subtle discoloration of the grain that spread with alarming speed. The agriculturalists tried everything in their power to halt its advance. They burned infected sections. They applied chemical treatments provided by the Mechanicus enclaves. They even imported new strains from off-world in the hopes of breeding resistance. Nothing worked. Within a month, half the crops were lost. Within 2, the situation had become dire. My father called a council of all available knights. At that time, only myself, Lucius, and our fourth brother Marius were present on Virilia. The others were engaged in campaigns across the sector, lending their strength to Imperial Guard regiments or answering calls for aid from neighboring systems. Alcides looked older than I had ever seen him, the weight of his responsibility etched into the deep lines of his face. We sat in the great hall of Castellan, surrounded by the banners and trophies of our ancestors. Servitors moved silently among us, filling goblets with wine and adjusting the great braziers that provided heat to the cavernous space. Our father did not speak immediately. Instead, he activated a hololithic projector at the center of the table, displaying the extent of the blight across our holdings. The red stain covered nearly 80% of the arable land under our protection. And it was still spreading. The few remaining healthy fields were barely enough to feed the population of Virilia itself, let alone meet our tithe obligations to the Imperium. It was Lucius who broke the silence. Always the pragmatist, the heir apparent spoke with a cold calculation that had earned him our father's approval. We must reduce the population to sustainable levels, he said. The remaining harvest can support perhaps a third of the current peasantry. The rest are now surplus to requirements. I remember the way my stomach twisted at his words. Not because the concept was alien to me, the nobility of the Imperium have always viewed human life as a resource to be managed, but because of the dreams that immediately flooded back into my consciousness. I saw again the faces of the peasants looking up at my knight in terror. I heard again their prayers, not for salvation from external threats, but from us, their supposed protectors. And yet I said nothing. What alternative could I offer? Without food they would starve regardless. At least a managed culling would be quick, efficient, relatively merciful compared to the slow death of starvation. This was the logic I used to silence the disquiet in my soul. Marius suggested we could request emergency supplies from our holdings on Valurus. Our home world was prosperous enough to spare some resources, surely. But even as he spoke, we all knew the logistics made such a solution impossible. The Imperium shipping lanes were stretched thin with priority given to military transports and supplies for ongoing campaigns. By the time aid could arrive from Valurus, the people would already be starving. In the end, it was decided that we would implement strict rationing immediately. The remaining healthy crops would be harvested and secured under armed guard. Each household in the settlements under our protection would receive an allotment based on their value to the continued functioning of our holdings. Skilled laborers, Those with technical knowledge or specialized abilities would receive full rations. Those deemed non-essential would receive enough to survive, if only barely. It was a brutal calculus, but one that the Imperium employs without hesitation across 1,000,000 worlds. The strong survive, the weak perish, and through this crucible, humanity endures. I left that meeting troubled, but resigned to our course of action. What I failed to anticipate was the reaction of the peasantry when the rationing was announced. For generations, the people of Varelia had accepted their lot without question. They toiled in the fields. They provided tithes to their lords. They gave their sons and daughters to the Imperial Guard when the tithe ships came. In return, they received protection from the Knights of House Terran. It was a covenant as old as the Imperium itself. But now that covenant was broken, we could not protect them from starvation. And in that failure, something fundamental changed in their perception of us. The first riot broke out in the settlement of Harrow's Mill. The local enforcers, themselves hungry and demoralized, were quickly overwhelmed. The grain stores were ransacked. The carefully calculated rationing plan rendered meaningless in a single night of desperate violence. Reports reached Castellan Terran by dawn, carried by a breathless messenger who had ridden through the night. My father's reaction was swift and unequivocal. This could not stand. Order must be restored. The people must be reminded of their place. I remember his exact words as he turned to me. His eyes, so like my own, were hard as flint. "Gas," he said. "Take righteous dominion to Harrow's Mill. Make an example of the ringleaders. Ensure there will not be a second riot." I bowed my head in acknowledgement, even as I felt a chill settle in my bones. This was my duty. This was what it meant to be a knight of House Terran, to maintain order, to enforce the will of the nobility upon those who served us. And yet, the dreams had returned the night before with renewed intensity. I had seen myself striding through the settlements, my thermal cannon glowing with barely contained energy. I had heard the screams, felt the satisfaction of the machine's spirit as it registered the termination of unworthy lives, and I had woken bathed in cold sweat, the taste of ash in my mouth. But I said nothing of this to my father. Instead, I proceeded directly to the Knight's Sanctum, where the sacristans were already preparing righteous dominion for deployment. The massive war machine stood in its cradle, power cables and fuel lines still attached like an infant in its mother's womb. Except this child was born for war. Its every aspect designed to bring death. The bonding ritual was briefer than usual. The urgency of the situation overriding the normal ceremonies. As the neural jack slid home, I felt the familiar pressure of the machine's spirit pressing against my consciousness. But now there was something else there, a sense of anticipation, of hunger. Righteous Dominion knew we were not marching to battle against orcs or traitors or other external foes. It knew we were being sent to punish those who were supposedly under our protection, and it approved. This realization disturbed me more than I could articulate, even to myself. But there was no time to dwell on it. The massive doors of the sanctum were already opening, revealing the gray morning light of Varelia. With a thought, I directed the knight to take its first ponderous steps, the deck plates of the sanctum trembling beneath its immense weight. The journey to Harrow's Mill would take several hours, even at the impressive pace of a knight. As I guided Righteous Dominion down the winding mountain path that led from Castellan Terran to the flatlands below, I tried to prepare myself mentally for what lay ahead. I had killed before. Of course, every knight pilot has. But those had been enemies of the Imperium, threats to humanity's dominion over the stars. This would be different. These were our own people, driven to desperation by hunger and fear. I told myself I would be merciful. I would identify the leaders of the riot, those who had incited the others to violence, and execute them cleanly. A thermal blast is instantaneous, after all. They would feel no pain and their deaths would serve a purpose, restoring order and potentially saving more lives in the long run. This was the rationalization I clung to. As Righteous Dominion marched inexorably toward Harrow's Mill, I could see the settlement from several kilometers away, a cluster of modest hab units and agricultural processing facilities nestled in a shallow valley. A thin column of smoke rose from near its center, evidence of the previous night's violence. As I drew closer, I expected to see the population hiding indoors, cowering from the approach of their lord's justice. Instead, I saw hundreds of people gathered in the main square, many armed with agricultural implements or makeshift weapons. They were not hiding. They were waiting. Through the enhanced visual feeds of my night, I could make out individual faces in the crowd. There was fear there, yes, but also determination. These were not mindless rioters. They were desperate people who had decided that death by a knight's weapons was preferable to slow starvation. In that moment, I understood that I had been sent not to restore order, but to crush resistance. To remind these people that their lives were worthless compared to the honor and authority of House Terran. I brought righteous dominion to a halt just outside the settlement proper. The massive war machine towered over the tallest structures, its shadow falling across the gathered crowd like a shroud. Using the external voxcasters, I addressed the people of Harrow's Mill. By order of Baron Alcides Terran, I declared, I am here to apprehend those responsible for the theft of Imperial resources and the murder of loyal enforcers. Surrender them now, and the rest of you will be spared. A murmur ran through the crowd, but no one stepped forward. Instead, an old man made his way to the front. His back was bent from decades of labor in the fields, his hands gnarled and calloused. But his eyes were clear and unwavering as he looked up at the towering form of my knight. There is nothing left to surrender, my lord, he called out, his voice carrying surprisingly well. The grain is gone, consumed by hungry mouths. As for the enforcers, they fired first. We only defended ourselves. More lies and sedition came the unbidden thought, though I was unsure if it originated from my own mind or from the influence of the throne mechanicum. These peasants dare to justify their actions. They must be taught their place. I fought to maintain my composure, to remember my intention to be merciful. I addressed the old man directly, focusing the voxcasters in his direction. The Imperium cannot function if every starving citizen takes matters into their own hands, I said. There are protocols, rationing plans. What you have done threatens everyone on Virilia, not just yourselves. The old man did not back down. Instead, he gestured to the thin, hungry faces around him, children with distended bellies, women with sunken cheeks, men whose muscles had begun to waste away. Look at us, my lord, he said. We are already dying. Your protocols and plans mean nothing to the hungry. We harvested these fields. We processed the grain. We built this settlement with our own hands. And now you would have us starve quietly while you sit in your mountain fortress with full bellies. His words struck me like physical blows. Because they were true. Because they echoed thoughts I had been afraid to acknowledge even to myself. Because they resonated with the dreams that had plagued me for months. But I was a knight of House Terran. I had a duty. I had my orders. With a thought, I activated the thermal cannon mounted on Righteous Dominion's right arm. The weapon hummed with deadly potential, the air around its barrel shimmering with heat. It was a warning, a final chance for compliance. Surrender the ring leaders, I repeated. This is your last opportunity. The old man did not move. Neither did anyone else in the crowd. Instead, to my astonishment, they began to chant. Not prayers to the Emperor for deliverance. Not pleas for mercy, but a simple, damning refrain. Let us eat. Let us eat. Let us eat. The chant grew in volume until it seemed to reverberate inside the cockpit of my knight, and with it came a pressure in my mind, a searing pain behind my eyes. The machine spirit of Righteous Dominion was growing agitated, eager to silence the disrespect, to crush the rebellion. I felt its bloodlust mingling with the memories of my ancestors. 1,000 years of unquestioned authority and swift retribution for any who dared challenge it. For a moment, I was no longer Gas Terran. I was every baron who had ever piloted this night. I was the embodiment of House Terran's will. And that will demanded blood. The thermal cannon fired. A lance of heat so intense it appeared almost solid erupted from the weapon, striking the center of the crowd. Those directly in its path simply ceased to exist, vaporized so quickly they had no time to scream. Those nearby suffered worse fates, their bodies partially melted, their agonized shrieks cutting through the sudden silence like knives. The smell reached me even through the sealed cockpit of my knight, the stench of burning flesh, of hair and clothing, and hope reduced to ash. And with it came a wave of emotion from the throne mechanicum, a sensation so alien and yet so familiar that it took me precious seconds to identify it. Satisfaction. The machine spirit was pleased. The survivors were running now, scattering in all directions, their earlier defiance forgotten in the face of such overwhelming destructive power. But the throne mechanicum was not content. One blast was not enough. These peasants had dared to challenge their betters. They must be taught a lesson that would echo across all of Varelia. I fought against the impulse, trying to reassert control. These people were not enemies of the Imperium. They were citizens, subjects of the God Emperor, just as I was. They were hungry, desperate, afraid. They did not deserve extermination. But the machine had tasted blood, and it wanted more. The memories of my ancestors pressed against my consciousness, reminding me of similar rebellions put down with similar brutality. This was the way it had always been. This was the natural order of things. The thermal cannon fired again and again and again, each blast reducing more of Harrow's mill to smoldering ruin. Each blast killing dozens who had no defense against such a weapon. Each blast driving me further from my humanity and deeper into communion with the machine. I do not know how long the slaughter continued. Time seemed to stretch and distort within the cockpit, minutes expanding into hours, seconds into eternities. I remember fragments, snapshots of horror seared into my memory. A mother clutching her child as both were consumed by the thermal blast. A man throwing himself futilely against the leg of my knight, his makeshift spear shattering against the adamantium plate. The grain storage facilities collapsing in flames, ensuring that even survivors would find no sustenance among the ruins. When it was finally over, when the thermal cannon had exhausted its fuel cells, and the machine spirit had satiated its thirst for retribution, Harrow's mill was no more. What had once been a thriving settlement was now a smoking crater, the bodies of its inhabitants reduced to ash and charred bone, and I felt nothing. No remorse, no guilt, no horror at what I had done. The throne mechanicum had temporarily overwritten my emotional responses, protecting me from the psychological trauma of mass slaughter. It was a feature, not a malfunction. Knights must be able to make difficult decisions to enact terrible violence when necessary without being crippled by human weakness. As I guided righteous dominion back toward Castellanterin, I told myself that I had done my duty. I had followed my father's orders. I had restored order in the only way possible. The example of Harrow's mill would ensure that no other settlement dared to riot, no matter how hungry they became. It was brutal but necessary. This was the price of the Imperium's survival in a hostile galaxy. But as the connection with the throne mechanicum began to fade, as the autonomous systems took over the routine task of marching home, allowing my consciousness to partially disengage from the interface, I became aware of something strange. A whisper at the edge of my perception. No, not one whisper. Hundreds, thousands. At first, I thought it was merely the lingering influence of the machine spirit, echoes of the communion gradually fading as my mind reasserted its independence. But as I listened, I began to distinguish words, prayers. The same desperate pleas I had heard in my dreams, but now they were awake with me, carried on the wind, or perhaps transmitted directly into my mind through some unexplained phenomenon. The dying prayers of Harrow's mill, the final thoughts of those I had just murdered somehow captured by the sensitive augurs of my knight or perhaps by the throne mechanicum itself. And they were not cursing my name or the name of House Terran. They were not calling for vengeance or damnation. They were simply asking for the Emperor's mercy, for an end to their suffering, for understanding in whatever came after death. I tried to shut out the voices, to focus on the path ahead, on the report I would deliver to my father. But they persisted, growing louder with each passing kilometer. By the time Castellanterin came into view, the whispers had become a cacophony, a deafening chorus of the dead that threatened to drown out my own thoughts. With trembling hands, I disengaged from the throne mechanicum. As soon as righteous dominion was secured in its maintenance cradle, the sacristans approached, ready to begin their post-deployment rituals. But I waved them away. I needed solitude. I needed silence. But the voices followed me. They followed me through the halls of Castellanterin, past the curious glances of serfs and the respectful nods of house guards. They followed me into the private chapel where I knelt before the Aquila seeking absolution or at least temporary peace. They followed me into my chambers where I collapsed onto my bed, covering my ears in a futile attempt to block them out. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no relief. The dreams were worse than ever, but now they were not prophetic, but retrospective. I relived the slaughter of Harrow's Mill in excruciating detail, but from the perspective of the victims. I felt the terror of the old man as the thermal cannon targeted him. I felt the despair of mothers trying to shield their children from an unstoppable force. I felt the disbelief of men who had spent their lives in loyal service to House Terran, now dying by the hand of their supposed protector. I awoke screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat. Dawn was still hours away, but I knew I would find no more rest that night. Instead, I dressed and made my way to my father's study. I needed to deliver my report, to fulfill at least that much of my duty. Perhaps in the mundane rituals of obligation, I could find some respite from the voices. Alcides was awake despite the early hour. He sat behind his massive desk, data slates and parchments spread before him, the weight of his responsibility evident in the slump of his powerful shoulders. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "It is done," I said simply. My father nodded. He did not ask for details. He did not need to. The purpose of my mission had been clear, and the lack of communication from Harrow's Mill told him everything he needed to know about its success. "Good," he replied. "Word has already spread to the other settlements. The rationing plan is being accepted without further incident." He said this with satisfaction, as if the deaths of hundreds, perhaps thousands, was a small price to pay for compliance. And once I would have agreed with him, once I would have seen the matter as closed, a regrettable necessity in service to a higher purpose. But the voices would not allow such easy dismissal. "They deserved better from us," I found myself saying, the words escaping before I could reconsider them. "They were loyal subjects of the Emperor. They were hungry." Alcides looked at me sharply, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, I thought he would reprimand me for such weakness. Instead, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "All subjects of the Emperor must be prepared to sacrifice gas," he said. "Those who cannot accept this truth become a danger to everyone around them. You did what was necessary. Do not doubt that." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to embrace the cold certainty that had guided House Terran for millennia, but the voices whispered otherwise. I nodded stiffly and took my leave. As I closed the door behind me, I heard my father murmur something to himself. It sounded like, "The throne changes them all in time." I did not understand the significance of those words then. I would soon enough. The following days passed in a blur of activity. The remaining fields were harvested under heavy guard. The rationing plan was implemented across all settlements under our protection. The Mechanicus enclaves continued their futile efforts to combat the blight. And through it all, the voices persisted, a constant chorus in my mind that grew louder whenever I approached the night sanctum. I avoided my next communion with righteous dominion as long as possible, claiming minor injuries from the previous deployment that needed time to heal. The sacristans were skeptical, but did not challenge a son of House Terran directly. Eventually, though, I could delay no longer. A report of orc activity near the eastern forests demanded a response, and I was the only night pilot available. Lucius was occupied with administrative duties, and Marius had been dispatched to a neighboring system to request emergency aid. As I approached the sanctum, the voices rose to a fever pitch, drowning out the chanting of the tech priests and the hum of machinery. I steeled myself, forcing one foot in front of the other, reminding myself of my duty to House and Imperium. The throne mechanicum waited, its neural interfaces gleaming in the dim light. I settled myself into it, feeling the familiar contours molding to my body. The sacristans moved around me, connecting cables, adjusting settings, murmuring binaric prayers to soothe the machine spirit. And then the neural jack slid home. The communion hit me like a physical blow. The machine spirit of righteous dominion surged into my consciousness with unprecedented force, as if eager to resume our connection. But it brought with it the voices, no longer distant whispers, but immediate and overwhelming, as if the dead of Harrow's Mill had somehow imprinted themselves upon the night systems. I gasped, my body convulsing in the throne as I fought to maintain control. The sacristans stepped back, alarmed by my reaction. Through blurred vision, I saw them consulting with one another, their mechadendrites waving in agitated patterns. I need to disconnect, I tried to say, but my mouth would not form the words. The machine spirit had seized control of my motor functions, preventing me from breaking the communion. It wanted something from me. It wanted me to understand. Images flooded my mind. Not memories, not dreams, but something in between. I saw righteous dominion striding across the fields of Virilia. But now the perspective was split. I saw through the augur arrays of the night, the tactical readouts and targeting solutions that guided its weapons. But simultaneously, I saw through human eyes looking up at the towering war machine. I felt the awe and the terror. I felt the despair, and I understood. The Throne Mechanicum did not merely record the experiences of its pilots. It recorded everything. Every life ended by its weapons. Every prayer uttered in its presence. Every emotion felt in its shadow. All of it stored in ancient data stacks beyond the comprehension of even the most adept tech priest. But more than that, I understood the true nature of the bond between knight and pilot. It was not, as I had been taught, a simple matter of bloodline compatibility and neural conditioning. It was a spiritual communion. The machine needed something from us just as we needed something from it. And what it needed, what it fed upon, was not our devotion or our skill or our genetic purity. It was our capacity for violence, our willingness to inflict suffering, our ability to rationalize atrocity in the name of duty. The revelation struck me like a thunderbolt. The Knights of House Terran, the noble defenders of humanity, were not heroes. We were vessels for ancient machines that fed on human misery. And we had been carefully conditioned generation after generation to provide that sustenance without question. I fought against this knowledge, trying to reject it as heresy or madness. But the evidence surrounded me, encoded in the very systems of righteous dominion. The machine spirit was most content, most responsive after acts of destruction. It did not distinguish between orcs and humans in its hunger. It only knew the satisfaction of power unleashed, of life extinguished. And my ancestors had known this on some level. The memories encoded in the Throne Mechanicum carried echoes of their own moments of doubt, quickly suppressed by the overwhelming weight of tradition and duty. They had felt what I was feeling, and they had chosen to embrace it, to become willing partners in this ancient, terrible covenant. I do not know how long I remained locked in communion with righteous dominion, trapped in this spiral of revelation and denial. Eventually, the machine spirit released its hold on me, perhaps satisfied that I had seen enough, that I understood the truth that could never be spoken aloud. When I emerged from the throne, the sacristans regarded me with concern. My vital signs had been erratic, they informed me. The communion had lasted hours longer than intended. They feared neural damage, perhaps even permanent impairment of my ability to pilot. I assured them I was fine, though nothing could have been further from the truth. I was shattered, my entire worldview in ruins, but I could not share this with them. The tech priests served the Omnisia and through it the machine spirits of the knights. They would not help me. They might even view my revelations as tech heresy punishable by servitor conversion or worse. The orc incursion still needed to be addressed. With mechanical precision, I guided righteous dominion out of the sanctum and toward the eastern forests. But this time I was acutely aware of the machine spirit's anticipation, its hunger for the coming violence. And I was aware of something else. A flaw in the interface between my mind and the night systems. A crack in the spirit interface. A small imperfection that had perhaps always been there, but which I noticed now only because I was looking for it, searching desperately for any way to assert my humanity against the machine's influence. It was not enough to break the communion entirely, but it might be enough to maintain a portion of myself separate from the throne's conditioning. The orcs were easy enough to find. A warband of perhaps 100 Greenkins armed with crude choppers and a handful of ramshackle firearms. They had raided an outlying farm, killing the family that lived there and taking their food stores. Now they were making their way deeper into Virilia, drawn by the prospect of more loot and combat. In normal circumstances, they would have presented no challenge to a knight. I could have eliminated them from maximum range with the thermal cannon, never giving them a chance to close distance or employ their limited anti-armor capabilities. But I hesitated, not out of fear or tactical uncertainty, but because I could feel the machine spirit's eagerness. It wanted me to use the thermal cannon, to experience again the satisfaction of mass slaughter. And in that moment, I made a decision. I would deny it. Instead of the thermal cannon, I activated the Reaper Chainsword mounted on Righteous Dominion's left arm. The massive blade roared to life, its adamantium teeth spinning at incredible speed. It was still a devastating weapon, more than capable of dispatching the orc threat. But it would require close combat, individual kills rather than wholesale destruction. It would be messy, dangerous, and provide far less of the corporeal, emotional sustenance that the machine spirit craved. I felt its displeasure immediately, a pressure behind my eyes that quickly escalated to searing pain. The Throne Mechanicum tried to override my decision, to force my consciousness into alignment with its desires. But I clung to that flaw in the interface, that small imperfection that allowed me to maintain a fraction of independence. The battle that followed was neither elegant nor efficient. I waded into the orc warband like a reaper into a field of wheat, the Chainsword rising and falling in brutal arcs. The Greenkins fought back with characteristic ferocity, some even managing to climb onto the legs of my knight and attack with explosive charges or power tools designed to breach armor. The damage they inflicted was minimal, barely registering on the knight systems. But each impact, each minor breach in the external plating sent a jolt of pain through my body via the neural interface. The Throne Mechanicum ensured that I felt every wound inflicted upon Righteous Dominion, a reminder of our shared existence. Yet I persisted, refusing to employ the thermal cannon despite the tactical advantages it would have provided. By the time the last orc fell, my body was bathed in sweat, my muscles trembling from the strain of fighting both the external enemy and the machine spirit's influence. I returned to Castellan Terran, victorious, but changed. The voices of Harrow's Mill still whispered in my mind, but they were joined now by a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be a knight of House Terran. We were not the noble protectors I had believed us to be. We were vessels for ancient weapons that fed on death and suffering. And we had been complicit in this arrangement for 10,000 years. The realization left me hollow, my sense of purpose and identity stripped away like bark from a dead tree. What was I to do with this knowledge? How could I continue to serve knowing what I now knew? The answer came in the form of unexpected news. My brother Lucius, the heir apparent, had been killed in a hunting accident. The details were vague. Something about a malfunction in his gravechute during a pursuit of the massive aerial predators that inhabited Virelia's upper atmosphere. But the implication was clear. With Marius offworld and the other brothers engaged in distant campaigns, I was now the most senior son present on Virelia. My father summoned me to his private chambers that evening. Alcides looked diminished somehow, the loss of his firstborn adding yet another burden to his already considerable load. He did not mince words. The line of succession must be preserved, he said. You will assume Lucius's duties effective immediately, and when my time comes, you will become Baron of House Terran's holdings on Virelia. I should have felt honored. This was an elevation beyond anything I had ever expected as the ninth son. Instead, I felt only a deepening dread. To become Baron would mean even closer communion with the knights, perhaps even graduating from Righteous Dominion to one of the more powerful patterns reserved for the ruling line. It would mean embracing the very symbiosis that I now recognized as fundamentally corrupt. But I said none of this to my father. Instead, I bowed my head in apparent acceptance of my new role. Perhaps, I thought, with this authority I could begin to change things. Perhaps I could find a way to break the cycle, to forge a new relationship between House Terran and the people of Virelia, one based on genuine protection rather than exploitation and fear. It was a naive hope, I realize now. The system was too entrenched, the conditioning too complete, but it gave me purpose in the dark days that followed. As heir apparent, I was granted access to records and traditions previously kept from me. I learned more about the history of our house, about the ancient pacts with the Mechanicus that provided us with the technology and knowledge to maintain our knights, and I learned about the rare cases of pilots who had rejected the communion, who had fought against the influence of the Throne Mechanicum. None had succeeded, not completely. The machine spirits were too powerful, the neural conditioning too thorough, but some had managed to carve out small spaces of independence, to maintain some semblance of their humanity despite the pressure to conform. These pilots were viewed with suspicion by their peers, often relegated to defensive duties or administrative roles where their reluctance to embrace the full communion would cause minimal disruption. I began to model myself after these outliers, deliberately holding back a portion of myself during each communion with righteous dominion. I focused on that flaw in the interface, widening it through sheer force of will, creating a sanctuary within my own mind where the machine spirit could not reach. The sacristans noticed the change. They reported unusual readings during my communions, patterns that suggested incomplete neural alignment, but they could find no mechanical fault to explain the discrepancy. And I was still effective in combat, still able to fulfill my duties as a knight. So they watched and waited and worried. Meanwhile, the situation on Virilia continued to deteriorate. The Blight had now claimed nearly all the arable land. The rationing plan was keeping the population alive, but just barely. Hunger was a constant companion for even the most valued workers, and the tithe ships were due to arrive within months, expecting the usual contribution of grain and recruits. My father aged visibly under the strain. He spent long hours in consultation with the Mechanicus adepts, searching for some technological solution to the Blight. He dispatched messenger ships to our holdings on Valuris, pleading for aid despite the logistical challenges. He even considered the unthinkable, reaching out to other noble houses with whom we had ancient rivalries, seeking assistance in exchange for concessions or alliances. Nothing worked. The Blight was resistant to every treatment, every countermeasure. It was as if the very soil of Virilia had turned against us, rejecting the crops that had sustained human life for millennia. And through it all, the whispers in my mind continued. The voices of Harrow's Mill, joined now by others, an ever-growing chorus of the dead and the desperate. They were not accusatory, not demanding vengeance. They simply wanted to be heard, to have their suffering acknowledged, to know that their lives had meaning beyond their utility to their feudal lords. I began to listen, not just to endure the whispers as an unavoidable torment, but to actively pay attention to what they were saying. And in their simple pleas, I found a wisdom that had eluded the nobles of House Terran for generations. The people of Virilia did not want to be treated as gods. They did not need lords in towering war machines. They needed partners. They needed to be valued not just for their labor, but for their humanity. They needed to know that when disaster struck, they would not be sacrificed for expediency. I took these insights and tried to implement them in small ways. I adjusted the rationing plan to distribute food more equitably regardless of a person's value to production. I ordered the house guards to treat the populace with respect rather than contempt. I personally visited the remaining settlements not in righteous dominion but in a simple ground car, speaking directly with the people about their needs and fears. These actions earned me the suspicion of my father and the outright hostility of many of the house officers. They saw my behavior as weakness, as a dangerous precedent that undermined the very foundation of our authority. What they could not see, what I dared not tell them, was that I was fighting for the soul of House Terran, trying to forge a new path before it was too late. But time was running out. The tithe ships appeared in orbit. Massive Imperial vessels that would accept no excuses for shortfalls in the expected contribution. My father received the Imperial delegation in the Great Hall of Castellan Terran with me at his side as heir apparent. The tithe officer was a cold man, his face rigid with augmetics that betrayed little emotion. He listened to my father's explanation of the Blight, of the measures we had taken to minimize the impact, of our request for temporary reduction in our obligations. When Alcides finished speaking, the tithe officer consulted a data slate for several long minutes. The only sound in the great hall was the soft whirring of servitors as they maintained their stationary positions along the walls. Finally, the tithe officer looked up. His augmetic eyes glinted in the dim light. "The tithe must be met," he said, his voice as mechanically precise as his appearance. "The Departamento Munitorum has calculated the strategic importance of Virilia's contribution. Adjustments have been made for the reported blight. The new requirement is 60% of standard grain tithe and 100% of standard manpower tithe." My father blanched. Even the reduced grain tithe would leave our people with virtually nothing. And the manpower tithe, Taking the strongest and most capable workers would cripple our ability to recover from the blight, even if we somehow survived the immediate crisis. That is impossible, my father said, an edge of desperation creeping into his voice. We cannot meet those demands and maintain the viability of our holdings. I request an emergency dispensation to be repaid with interest when the blight is conquered. The tithe officer's expression did not change. His augmetic hand made a small notation on the data slate. Refusal to meet the adjusted tithe will be recorded as sedition, he said. The consequences for House Terran would be severe. Your status as an aligned Knight House provides some latitude but not indefinite protection from Imperial judgment. It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Either we provided what the Imperium demanded, or we would face sanction. An Imperial sanction against a noble house typically involved inquisitorial investigation, potential forfeiture of titles and holdings, even execution of the ruling family if the perceived offense was severe enough. My father's shoulders slumped in defeat. He would comply. He had no choice. And compliance meant death for a significant portion of Virelia's remaining population, either through starvation after the grain was taken or through conscription into the meat grinder of the Imperial Guard. I could not remain silent, not with the voices of Harrow's Mill screaming in my mind, not with the knowledge of what our knights truly were, not with the understanding I had gained through my small acts of compassion toward our people. There is another way, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. Both my father and the tithe officer turned to look at me, surprised by my interruption. Virelia has other resources, I continued. Our mountains contain rare minerals valuable to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Our forests harbor unique biological compounds used in certain medicinal applications. We can offer these as substitutes for the grain tithe. And we can implement training programs to improve the quality of our manpower tithe even if we cannot meet the full quantity. It was a desperate gambit, cobbled together from fragments of knowledge I had gathered during my recent studies of Virelia's complete resource profile. I had no idea if these alternatives would be acceptable to the implacable bureaucracy of the Departamento Munitorum. The tithe officer stared at me for a long moment, his augmetic eyes whirring slightly as they adjusted focus. Then he returned his attention to the data slate, fingers moving rapidly across its surface. Minerals of sufficient purity would be acceptable at a conversion rate of 8:1 by value, he finally said. Biological compounds at a rate of 12:1. Documentation of training protocols must be submitted for evaluation before any quality adjustment to manpower requirements can be considered. The rates were punitive, designed to extract maximum value regardless of the form it took, but they offered a slim chance of survival for the people of Virelia. If we could mine enough or harvest enough of the rare fungi that grew in the deepest parts of the forests, perhaps we could meet the tithe without condemning our population to starvation. My father looked at me with a mixture of surprise and weary approval. The negotiations continued for several more hours, becoming increasingly technical as we worked through the details of the alternative arrangement. By the time the tithe officer departed, we had a tentative agreement that might, if we were very fortunate and worked with absolute efficiency, allow Virelia to survive. As we watched the tithe officer's shuttle ascend toward the waiting ships in orbit, my father turned to me. "That was well done, Gas," he said. "I did not know you had made such a study of our resources." "I served as I was able," I replied, careful to maintain the formal language expected between Baron and heir. The survival of House Terran depends on the survival of Virelia itself. My father nodded slowly. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the same doubts that had consumed me, the same questioning of the ancient traditions that guided our house. But if it was there, it was quickly suppressed. "Implement your plan," he said. "You have full authority to allocate resources as needed. But remember, the honor of House Terran must be maintained. We cannot appear weak before our people, especially now." I bowed my head in acknowledgement, recognizing both the opportunity and the constraint he had placed upon me. I could try to save the people of Virelia, but I could not fundamentally change the relationship between them and House Terran. Not yet, at least. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. I organized mining expeditions into the mountains, directed teams of gatherers into the forests, established processing facilities to refine the raw materials into the forms required by the tithe. The entire population of Virilia was mobilized, working desperately against the looming deadline. And throughout it all, I maintained my communion with righteous dominion. Not because I embraced the role of Knight Pilot, but because I needed the authority it conferred. The people needed to see that a son of House Terran was leading them, that their efforts were supported by the power and prestige of their lords. Even as I inwardly recoiled from what the Knight represented, I used its symbolic weight to drive our collective endeavor forward. The strain began to tell on me. The constant resistance against the Throne Mechanicum's influence left me exhausted, my mind raw and aching after each communion. The voices of the dead never quieted, a constant reminder of the price of failure. And the physical demands of overseeing operations across the entire planet pushed my body to its limits. But slowly, impossibly, we began to make progress. The miners extracted veins of rare elements from the mountains. The gatherers returned with sacks of the luminescent fungi that the Mechanicus valued so highly for certain arcane processes. The refineries operated day and night, processing the raw materials into the exacting specifications required by the tithe. There were losses, of course. Cave-ins claimed the lives of miners. Predators attacked gathering teams in the deeper forests. Exhaustion and malnutrition weakened even the strongest workers, making accidents more frequent and recovery more difficult. But compared to the wholesale death that would have resulted from the original tithe requirements, these casualties were acceptable. Or so I told myself. As the deadline approached, it became clear that we would fall short of the full alternative tithe, but not by much, perhaps 10% below the required value. In normal circumstances, this would be enough to trigger Imperial sanctions, but I had one final card to play. I requested a private audience with the tithe officer, who had remained on Virilia to oversee the collection process. He received me in the austere quarters he had been assigned within Castellan Terran, his data slate at hand as always. "We will not quite meet the full value of the alternative tithe," I said without preamble. "I estimate a shortfall of approximately 10%. The tithe officer's augmetic eyes whirred. Failure to meet agreed-upon tithe requirements will be recorded as, he began, but I interrupted him. House Terran will make up the difference, I said. Not from Virilia, but from our own resources. The difference in value will be paid through combat service. This was a desperate gamble. Knight houses occasionally fulfilled part of their remaining obligation to the Imperium through direct military support rather than material tithes. But such arrangements were typically negotiated well in advance, not offered as last-minute substitutes for failed material contributions. The tithe officer regarded me impassively. "Elaborate," he said. I took a deep breath. "I am offering my personal service along with that of my knight, Righteous Dominion, 1 year of campaign duty under direct Imperial command, to be deployed as needed without the usual noble house constraints regarding appropriate enemies or conditions of service." It was an extraordinary concession. Knights typically fought alongside Imperial forces as honored allies, not as subordinate units. They chose their battles carefully, focusing on worthy opponents that would bring glory to their house. What I was offering amounted to mercenary service with none of the prestige or autonomy that knight pilots typically enjoyed. The tithe officer made calculations on his data slate, his fingers moving with inhuman precision. After several minutes of silence, he looked up. The combat value of a knight-errant with experienced pilot deployed without constraint for 1 standard year would exceed the shortfall by approximately 28.4%, he said. This would create a tithe credit for Virilia in subsequent collection cycles. I nodded. That was even better than I had hoped. Not only would it cover the current shortfall, but it would give Virilia a buffer for the next tithe cycle, providing precious time for recovery from the blight. I accept these terms on behalf of the Departamento Munitorum, the tithe officer continued. Prepare your knight for transport. You will depart with the tithe ships in 3 days. 3 days. I had expected at least a few weeks to prepare, to put the alternative tithe operations on a sustainable footing, to ensure that the gains we had made would not be lost in my absence. But I could not risk negotiating further. The deal was struck, and Virilia would survive. I returned to my father with the news. Alcides listened in silence as I explained the arrangement. When I finished, he rose from his desk and walked to the window that overlooked the courtyard below. For a long moment he said nothing, his back to me, his hands clasped behind him. "You have bound yourself to Imperial service," he finally said, "without consulting me, without considering the implications for House Terran." "There was no other way to meet the tithe," I replied. "And the alternative was Imperial sanction against our entire house." My father turned to face me, his expression grave. "Do you understand what you have done, Gas? You have placed a knight of House Terran, a war machine with 10,000 years of glorious history, at the disposal of Imperial commanders who will use it as they would any other weapon. They will send you against unworthy opponents. They will waste your skills on trivial objectives. They will treat righteous dominion as nothing more than a particularly powerful tank." "I understand," I said, "and I accept those consequences." Alcides studied my face, searching for something. Perhaps doubt, perhaps fear, perhaps the familial pride that had always been the cornerstone of House Terran's identity. Whatever he was looking for, he did not seem to find it. "Very well," he said at last. "The arrangement is made, and I will not overturn it. But know this, Gas. When you return, if you return, you will no longer be heir to Virilia. I will name Marius in your place." The words struck like physical blows, but I kept my expression neutral. I had expected some form of punishment for my unilateral decision, but disinheritance was severe, even by the harsh standards of noble houses. It meant that upon my return I would be little more than a night pilot with no authority beyond the battlefield. "I accept your judgment, my lord," I said formally. "The survival of Virilia is worth the price." My father's expression hardened. "Is it?" he asked. "Or have you simply traded one form of destruction for another? The people live for now. But what of House Terran? What of 10,000 years of tradition and honor?" I had no answer that would satisfy him. The divide between us was too great, our understanding of duty and honor too different. So I bowed and took my leave, retreating to my chambers to prepare for departure. The remaining time passed quickly. I oversaw the final preparations for the alternative tithe, issuing instructions that would hopefully maintain the operations in my absence. I briefed the house officers who would be responsible for continuing the work, emphasizing the importance of treating the workers with respect and care. And I communed with Righteous Dominion one last time on Virilia. The machine spirit sensed the change in circumstances, the impending deployment to unknown battlefields. It was eager, anticipating the violence to come. I felt its hunger pressing against my mind, trying to infect me with the same bloodlust. But I resisted, clinging to that flaw in the interface, that small space of independence I had cultivated. I would need it in the coming year. Imperial commanders would expect unquestioning obedience, the kind that came naturally to knights whose pilots were fully merged with their thrones. I would have to simulate that obedience while maintaining enough separation to prevent the machine spirit from overwhelming my humanity entirely. On the morning of my departure, I stood in the courtyard of Castellan, Righteous Dominion looming behind me, already secured on the massive transport platform that would carry it to the waiting tithe ships. My father had not come to see me off, a final statement of his disapproval. But to my surprise, a large crowd had gathered outside the gates. They were people from the nearby settlements, miners and gatherers, refinery workers, and agricultural laborers. They stood in silence, watching as the final preparations for my departure were completed. Their faces were thin from hunger, their bodies marked by the toll of hard labor, but their eyes held something I had never seen directed toward a son of House Terran before. Not fear, not reverence, but gratitude. Simple human gratitude. As the transport platform began to rise, lifted by straining anti-grav generators, the crowd moved, not to disperse, as I had expected, but to kneel. One by one, then in waves they dropped to their knees, not in the formal posture required by protocol when addressing their lords, but in the deeper genuflection reserved for saints and saviors. The sight struck me to my core. These people who had suffered so much under the rule of House Terran, who had seen their fellows slaughtered at Harrow's Mill, who had endured hunger and fear and crushing labor, were honoring me. Not because I was their lord, not because I commanded a knight, but because I had fought for their survival. And in that moment, as the transport platform cleared the walls of Castellan and began its journey toward orbit, I understood the truth that had eluded me and my ancestors for 10,000 years. The knights of House Terran were not gods of metal, not heralds of the Emperor's justice. We were weapons, tools of an Imperium that valued human life only in the aggregate, never in the individual. The thermal cannons and Reaper chainswords, the ion shields and adamantium plate, all of it existed not to protect humanity, but to enforce compliance, to ensure that the tithes were met, that the populations remained docile, that the great machine of the Imperium continued to function regardless of the cost in human suffering. But it did not have to be that way. Even within the constraints of the Imperium, even with the terrible symbiosis between knight and pilot, there was room for compassion. For recognizing the humanity of those we were sworn to protect, for placing their welfare above the hollow concepts of honor and tradition that had guided House Terran for millennia. As the atmosphere thinned around the rising transport, as Virilia dwindled to a blue-green sphere below, I made a silent vow. I would survive the year of service. I would resist the machine spirit's hunger for atrocity. And I would return to Virilia, not as heir, not as lord, but as protector in truth. I would show my father, my house, and the Imperium itself that there was strength in compassion, power in restraint. The voices of Harrow's Mill whispered their approval, and for the first time since the massacre, they brought not torment, but resolve. Their deaths would have meaning if I could forge a new path for House Terran. If I could ensure that no other settlement would suffer the same fate. The transport docked with the tithe ship, a massive vessel that would carry me to whatever war zone the Departamento deemed most in need of a knight's firepower. As I stepped from the platform, I was met by an Imperial officer whose uniform bore the insignia of the Astra Militarum High Command. Knight Gas Terran, he said, his voice clipped and efficient. You have been assigned to Battle Group Terminus. Deployment to the Cheridan sector. Orc Infestation Designation. BHOG. Estimated campaign duration 8 to 12 months. Probability of survival 30%. I acknowledged the information with a nod. The officer continued, outlining the strategic objectives, the composition of the battle group, the chain of command I would be operating within. But I was only half listening. My mind was already turning to the challenges ahead, to the balancing act between obedience to Imperial command and resistance to the machine spirit's bloodlust, to the struggle to maintain my humanity in the face of what would undoubtedly be industrial-scale slaughter. As the officer concluded his briefing, he gave me a curious look. Most night pilots he had encountered, he explained, expressed either eagerness for combat or concern about the specific enemies they would face. My calm acceptance was unusual. I am not most night pilots, I told him. I serve not for glory or for the honor of my house, but for the survival of my world. He seemed taken aback by this answer, but quickly regained his professional demeanor. Your motivations are irrelevant, Knight Terran, he said. Your obedience to command is all that matters. I bowed my head in apparent acceptance. Let him think me an aberration, an oddity among the normally proud and independent knights. It would make my task easier if my Imperial commanders underestimated my capacity for independent thought. As I was escorted to my quarters aboard the tithe ship, I passed the massive cargo holds where Virilia's alternative tithe was being stored, containers of refined minerals, preservative tanks filled with the luminescent fungi, and most valuable of all, the carefully selected recruits who would join the Imperial Guard, young men and women who might have died of starvation on Virilia, but now faced a different kind of death on distant battlefields. I paused to watch as they were processed by Munitorum officials. Their names and origins recorded, their bodies examined for fitness, their minds probed for signs of instability or resistance. They looked frightened, as well they should. Few would survive their term of service, but they would live longer than they would have on a starving Virilia, and there was always the slim chance that some would complete their service and return home, bringing with them skills and experiences that might benefit their world. That at least was what I told myself as I turned away from the site. Another rationalization, another compromise with the brutal reality of the Imperium. But it was all I had to offer them, all I could do within the constraints of the system I was born into. As the tithe ship broke orbit and began its journey to the Cheridan sector, I stood at a viewport and watched Virilia recede into the void. From this distance, the blight was invisible, the suffering of its people reduced to an abstract concept. It would be easy to forget, to lose myself in the rhythm of war and duty that awaited me. Many night pilots did exactly that, finding purpose in endless combat, in the communion with their machines, in the simple clarity of destroying the Emperor's enemies. But the voices of Harrow's Mill would not let me forget. They would remain with me through the battles to come, a constant reminder of the true cost of the Imperium's survival, a constant challenge to find a better way, even within a system that rejected the very concept of improvement. I turned from the viewport as Virilia disappeared from view, swallowed by the vastness of space. Ahead lay a year of war, of struggle against both external enemies and the machine spirit of righteous dominion. Beyond that, an uncertain return to a world and a house that might no longer accept me. But I had made my choice. The thermal cannons of righteous dominion would still fire. The Reaper Chainsword would still cleave through the Imperium's foes. I would still be a knight of House Terran, still a weapon of incredible destructive power, but I would wield that power with awareness of its cost, with respect for the lives it affected, with a goal of protection rather than domination. And perhaps in that small difference, I could begin to change what it meant to be a knight. Not a god of metal, not a herald of judgment, but a true guardian of humanity. Not feared, but genuinely revered. Not served, but worthy of service. It was a fragile hope, easily crushed by the weight of 10,000 years of tradition or the endless demands of the Imperium. But it was mine, and I would protect it as fiercely as righteous dominion protected me, nurture it as carefully as the sacristans nurtured the machine spirit, defend it as resolutely as House Terran defended its honor. For in that hope lay not just the future of Virilia, but the very soul of House Terran. And perhaps in some small way, a glimpse of what the Imperium could be if it remembered that its purpose was not merely to survive, but to preserve what made humanity worthy of survival in the first place.